Welcome to Riga Security Forum. This is the second edition of Riga Security Forum. This time it's virtual only, as many things in the new normal circumstances that we have. And we had the first edition with Andris Sprūts and the President of Latvia, Mr. Egils Levits. The second edition of the discussion was devoted to NATO in 2030 with Ambassador LIIA and Baiba Braže from NATO. And today we have the third episode, and this is naturally devoted to the election in the United States. And I have to say, unfortunately, things are not yet that clear. It's too soon to make a call, but nevertheless, we will make our best try to explain things in the United States and how they could impact the transatlantic link and the Baltic states in particular. And I have a great pleasure to welcome Professor Daniel S. Hamilton, who is joining us from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Professor. Professor Hamilton is Director of Programs devoted to the European Union and two institutions in DC. So the first is Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and the second is, since recently I understand, Woodrow Wilson Center for International Studies.
Yes, thank you.
And Professor is not only experienced in the academic affairs, but has been also official with the Department of State and has held senior positions over there. So that's why we will have not only, dry academic reflections, but also reflections based in experience. So, Professor, as things are, so as we speak, it's too early to call on who has won the presidential race and then who will be in charge of the Senate. So that's why let's start with the Baltic states and the United States. And may I ask you, what is the image of the Baltic states in the United States in DC? Because obviously most of the Americans probably are not that much interested in the region, but how things are in DC, in Congress, in the Department of State, in Pentagon?
Well, thank you again for hosting me here today. I appreciate it. I send greetings to all my friends in Latvia and in the region. Well, I think besides the election, you asked about the Baltic states, they have a very high reputation in the United States to the extent that people do pay attention, as you say. Usually Americans are focused on issues at home. And generally on foreign policy, but those who do pay attention to Europe and to issues regarding transatlantic security, for instance, of course, have a very strong, I think, impression of the Baltic states, each of them individually. I think it's a bipartisan approach. I don't think there is a partisan divide when it comes to thinking about our mutual shared values and commitment to each other's security. I think you have seen administrations led by each party, Democrat or Republican, have supported Baltic membership in NATO. The Baltic accession to NATO had to be bipartisan, just the way our system works. You have to get 2/3 of the U.S. Senate to agree, so that requires always bipartisan consensus, and we had it. I was in the Clinton administration when we set the frame for further NATO enlargement. I think it's important maybe for our Baltic friends to think about this, that the real debate about the principle of further NATO enlargement after the Cold War came with the accession of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic before we approached the Baltic issue. And at that time in the Senate, the Republicans had the majority, but they asked a Democrat who they had great confidence in to lead the debate to get accession, and that was Joe Biden. So very unusual that in a Republican-controlled Senate, a Democrat, Senator Joe Biden, was asked to get the bipartisan consensus done for NATO enlargement. So it speaks a bit to the role of I think this region, Central and Eastern Europe, that the U.S. remains committed to it, I think regardless of administration, and it's a positive feeling. And you see a lot of the Baltic American community in the United States was very active in the elections, whichever way they, their partisan differences took them, but very active. I think both sides courted that community in terms of winning them over for their side. But in terms of substance and going forward, I think one should not have concerns about any turnaway of U.S. commitment.
Thank you. And there were also some unfortunate situations recently with money laundering and similar issues. Is that also an issue that has impact on the Baltic image, especially of Latvia's?
Well, I think the question is probably Latvia's choice. The trends are leading to Joe Biden becoming the next president of the United States. He has said that corruption is so endemic around the world, it has become a national security issue. And he has said publicly that he would elevate that issue as sort of integral to broader national security strategies. So I think if that's the case, and we do have a Biden administration, one would hope that Latvia and other EU and NATO colleagues would join that effort. We tend to focus on problems and corruption coming from Russia and other countries, China, but many of our societies, we enable that corruption by not paying attention to our own laws or enforcing our own procedures. And I think that will be an important common focus as we go forward. I was just working with some colleagues on Balkan issues, so in Southeastern Europe, and the problem of corruption there, is really, really serious. So it's not an issue, that targets Latvia or any other country. It is a general and increasing problem, particularly because the digital revolution is enabling people to, move all sorts of types of illicit money, all sorts of places. We have to get a handle on that. Hopefully we do that together.
All right, and as you mentioned already in your remarks, the defense, which is the main issue for the Baltics, because when it comes to economic cooperation, obviously the United States is not among the main partners, but when it comes to defense, the United States is seen as the main strategic partner for each and every of the Baltic states. And it is also widely understood that if Russia respects any country, then that definitely is the United States. And since 2014, we have also quite permanent, though rotational, American boots on the ground. So American troops are rotating throughout the Baltic states, and American fighter jets and also bombers tend to overfly the skies of the Baltic states. And this is something that has continued already for a few years. So since the Ukrainian crisis unfolded, and that was the administration of Obama, which initiated these reinforcements, and they were also not diminished under Trump. But how things might develop in your view, because it's already like a few years, 6 or so years since things start to go wrong in Ukraine. I mean, the military conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and how long, can we expect this to continue? And maybe there are prospects for permanent boots on the ground, because this has been, on the agenda. The officials, both from Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, have been working on that, lobbying. We know, of course, the Poles, they have been quite active, and also with some rate of success. So they didn't manage to create the fourth Trump, as it was denoted, but nevertheless, there are more and more American soldiers. So what's your take on the future? Because it was a taboo before Ukraine. American boots on the ground, more or less permanent. It was something, quite distant. Now it's a reality, but for how long?
Yes. Well, again, let me be very clear. These are always my personal views. I'm not representing any other institution or grouping. I think we are, again, it really does depend on who is elected president. And it is a very stark choice. I believe if it doesn't seem likely right now, but if Donald Trump would be reelected, I think you should be concerned for your security because he has questioned the value of NATO. He treats it as a protection racket. If you don't pay up, you don't get protection. And whether NATO would exist in maybe a name, it would not exist much more longer in reality because there simply would be no trust in the U.S. commitment. And I think that would unravel European confidence. I hate to put it that stark of a way, but I think that is the option that one could face. The likelihood of that happening, fortunately, in my view, is low now. I think you find a different track coming with Joe Biden. He is personally, intensely a transatlanticist at his core. He feels it. It's instinctive. It's not something he has to learn. And he has called NATO a, quote, sacred duty, and that the first thing he would do on day one of his presidency would be to call other allied leaders and reaffirm the U.S. commitment. It's gotten to that point. So just as a matter of principle, I think the U.S. is making a major choice here for the future of Europe's security, not just for our own, domestic future. If you think about what's going on, the Biden administration, if it comes about, in my view, personal view, would be far tougher on Russia. Donald Trump was sort of Putin's buddy. It was very odd when they had their meetings. No note takers in the room. Nobody knew what they were talking about. It's a very strange relationship. Joe Biden is not Putin's chum. He has said very clearly Russia will have to pay for violating international law, for the illegal, illicit annexations that's happened, for deploying troops across borders, all the things we know about. That will have implications for NATO. I think you will see an effort, if it happens, to revive the alliance and point it to the future. My concern is that if Biden is elected, there will be two mistakes our European colleagues will make. One is to sort of breathe a sigh of relief and say we can go back to business as usual. I think that's wrong because the damage that's happened to our relationship over the last few years is such that we cannot go back to something. We have to look forward. And I'm afraid that there's a critical 2 months right now of November, December into January when the new president's inaugurated, not to waste that time. Not to wait for the U.S. to get its act together, but to come and think about proposals that Europe is prepared to, offer to a new U.S. administration. So that's mistake number one. Don't miss the opportunity to get ready. Mistake number two will come on Inauguration Day when it's clear that a new president will have to devote considerable time to the domestic challenges the United States is facing. You're seeing it on the television screens. The election is a reflection of it. I call it the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. It is the pandemic. Today we have 100,000 cases a day, 100,000 cases a day in this country of new infections. That's a record. It's getting worse. We never left the first wave of the pandemic. It's only getting worse, and this will have to be addressed. There is the economic recession in the United States, which drags down the world economy at the same time. There is an immense social reckoning that's going to happen in the United States because of systemic racial injustices and inattention to inequalities, which both the pandemic and the recession have brought out even more. And finally, there's a 4-year legacy of Donald Trump in which the rest of the world is wondering about America's, steadiness. And that'll have to be addressed. I can see European commentators saying, well, then Biden's becoming isolationist. I think that's wrong because foreign policy starts at home. And if the United States can't help itself, it won't ever be able to help others. So I would hope European allies would wish us well as we clearly have to tackle this immense challenges at home, sort of as a basis for our ability to be a reliable ally abroad. It'll take a little time, but I think you'll see Joe Biden, if he's elected, engage in a reassurance effort. There's no reason why we can't think of transatlantic recovery together. There's no reason why we can't build down barriers to medical equipment trade and work together on a vaccine. All these things are possible if our instinct is to turn to each other in such crisis, which I think will now be, back. That's the back to normal part. We are each other's, as Joe Biden has said, quote, partners of first resort, first resort. You turn instinctively to your closest partners when you have some problem. And I think that's what we will now see. What it means for Russia is, I think, nothing good for Mr. Putin, because he won't have a buddy in the White House. And you'll see a much tougher U.S. position.
Thank you, Professor. And you mentioned that Joe Biden is a transatlanticist, as quite many senators and representatives in the House. But not only the president is re-elected or elected. Now it's also about the Congress. And there might be quite so many new faces, and we have always officials, at least here in Riga and Tallinn and Vilnius, have said that even though Donald Trump is the president, we have very strong and bipartisan support in the Congress. But as we know, things are, changing also in the United States. We see the migration waves. They are not so much, related with Europe, rather with other regions. So other regions, especially, Asia, Latin America, they take a stronger role in the U.S. And for how long can we rely on this, in a way, natural transatlanticism, or things might, change sooner or later?
Well, I think if you look at the trends again, the election's really not over yet in terms of all the counting, but it looks like the Republicans will retain their majority in the U.S. Senate, and the Democrats will retain their majority in the House of Representatives. On these issues, though, related to Europe, there is a very strong bipartisan consensus. It was the Republicans in the Congress who sort of stopped Donald Trump from doing worse damage to NATO than he had said he would do. They are the ones who promoted the idea of greater support to Ukraine over the objections of the president. They have been clear in their financial support to NATO efforts, U.S. participation in NATO, and in fact had to restore money that President Trump had taken out of the budget. He took money intended for Europe, the European Deterrence Initiative, to build his wall in Mexico. He took money away from Europe to try to do that, and the Congress had to put the money back in, Republicans. So I think you'll see a stronger now alignment of views with the Senate and the Congress on European security. So I don't anticipate there actually a problem. I think it's better. In terms of your other question, I hear this a lot from European colleagues, that somehow social trends in the United States imply that the U.S. is drifting off to somewhere else. I don't quite understand it. It is, if I may say, transposing sort of European experience of ethnic grievances and difficulties to a very different continent that has a very different history. And that's not what people do when they come to the United States. They don't retain their bonds. Many of them have left those countries. They don't have the bonds, frankly. They want to be Americans. And any polls that you look at over decades will show that on basic questions of vital U.S. national interest, there is not a Hispanic American opinion or a Black American opinion or Asian American opinion. It is an American opinion. There are no differences between ethnic, oriented groups on the core questions of U.S. national security. There's just no evidence to show that whatsoever. When there's concern in Europe about the so-called pivot to Asia, one has to just, of course, recall the United States doesn't have the luxury of choice. We are a Pacific and an Atlantic power. We've never had to choose. We don't have the ability to choose. We are important to stability on both areas of the world and will remain so. It reflects a bit more, if I may say again, a European sense of its own issues rather than looking up. China's rise presents significant challenges to global order. It is becoming a competitor and a presence all through Europe. It challenges basic principles of the global commons, freedom of navigation, the Arctic, questions about outer space, rules-based order. Those are all questions that are not very far away from NATO or the Baltic states. They are, of course, issues right at home that we should confront together. So the world is changing, but I think the anchor is still the transatlantic relationship, and I think that will now continue. And it's not rooted in social societal differences in the United States. That's really just the wrong way to focus on trends in the U.S. If the U.S. drifts away from Europe, it's because it doesn't think Europe is offering the kind of help that it needs. The United States wants a Europe that's a counterpart to it, not a counterweight. And you hear often some European politicians say the whole purpose of the European Union is to build, quote, a counterweight. That was a quote by the German foreign minister, the current German foreign minister. If that's the purpose of the EU, to build a counterweight to the United States, that is an abandonment of the entire history of European integration, and certainly would never find US support. Who would be surprised if it didn't? It has to be a much more uplifting vision for Europe than something like that. And I turned to my European colleagues and asked, what is that vision? Can Europe get its act together enough to be the value-added partner for America, not only in Europe, but in many other places? That's an open question. And that's why I say, use the 2 months right now to get ready for an administration that's going to ask more of Europe, not less of Europe, because it expects more from its closest partner, not less. It wants to do more, but it will expect that the Europeans come with proposals and suggestions.
Yeah, indeed, it's not a one-way road; it's a two-way road, and of course, it's not only that we should expect something. Also, America is expecting from us, from Europe, I mean. But if I may ask you, what would you suggest, for example, for Baltic states? What else could we do here in the Baltics? Because now all three countries, they spend 2% of GDP for defense, which has been the loudest request by the Trump administration, and not only. So we are moving on with defense. There are serious steps taken, to clean the financial system in terms of prevention of money laundering and other activities. Even though modestly, the at least Latvian soldiers are deployed to missions operations abroad. It's also the case with other Baltic counterparts. So what else could we do? What would be most appreciated on the other shore of the ocean?
Right. Well, again, just a point of historical fact, the 2% was set by the Obama-Biden administration, not the Trump administration, before Trump ever became president. So that's been an important benchmark. But I think the question we have to ask is not how much money we spend, but what we get for our money, and whether 2% is the right metric for that question. I think we have to, my suggestion would be to, again, personal view, let's use NATO as a vehicle to update our alliance and turn it to the future. My suggestion would be to look at our strategic concept for the alliance. This is sort of the guiding document for NATO. It's updated every once in a while to reflect, the new realities. But it's very odd, it has not been updated since 2010. If you read it today, it's so out of date, it's embarrassing, frankly. It was written before Russian intervention in Ukraine. It was written before a whole host of issues that we've had to face, and it's out of date. So I think if we use that process, take a year, which usually takes a long time to get these documents right, have a quick summit next spring, and between that summit and a later summit, engage in a strategic concept review. I think that's where Latvia and other allies could make a real difference by including your voices in what NATO should be for the future. And let's not rest on what NATO was in the past. There are new generations, in our countries who need to understand NATO's future relevance, not that it was there during the Cold War or what we did in Afghanistan. That's not relevant to many of them. They want to know, what are we doing for the future? So I think we owe that by engaging in a new process. If you ask me, I would say it's a simple, my simple frame would be, the foundation for a new strategic concept would be for us to reaffirm the fundamental commitment we make in the North Atlantic Treaty, and that is to preserve our free institutions. Alliance cohesion, our ability to work together based on shared values, is the foundation of the alliance. It has come under severe strain in recent years, led by, frankly, the United States. But many other allies, if we're honest, have also seen some backsliding on democratic values. And as an alliance committed to those values, we have to look ourselves in the face together and say, we have to shore this up. We're not going to be credible unless we commit to that again. If we can do that, then that's the foundation for what we can do specifically. That means, again, reaffirming Article 5, our mutual defense agreement as part of the North Atlantic Treaty. It means updating deterrence and defense in ways that are more adept. If you think about the Baltic states, my personal view, we should have a NATO air policing mission. Air police, the Baltic states are never going to have your own, separate ability to do this. We have sort of been cobbling this together for years without really a satisfactory arrangement. I think NATO should consider how to do that. We should consider, in fact, more permanent stationing of forces. And these are all questions we need a consensus on, but these are ones I would personally think we should look at. Another core task that we need to look at, I think it's still relevant, but we need to update it, is crisis management. That's in the 2010 strategic concept. It has come to mean sort of, how do we deal with crises like Afghanistan and things very, very far away from NATO. But I think we have to look closer to home as well, and how we can use all the tools of the alliance to deal with crisis, how we manage crisis or prevent them from, getting out of hand. The third core task of the alliance is cooperative security. Again, I think that's a good term, but it has come to mean how we work with partners, the Partnership for Peace. And there are more partners now than members of NATO, and we need to have a better, more coherent kind of concept for that. And back to my point about China and so on, I think we should consider a NATO Indo-Pacific Council. It would be a council between NATO and other democratic partners of the alliance through the Indo-Pacific. That would give us a way to have a common assessment of broader challenges, as I mentioned, the global commons and others that we could share together. It's not expanding NATO to the Pacific. It's simply expanding our consultative possibilities with like-minded partners. But my real breakthrough, I think, and where Latvia and neighbors could make a real difference to the United States, is to think of a new core task, what I would call comprehensive resilience. If we think to the real challenges people worry about today, security, it is disruption to how our societies work, right? All the critical functions of our societies, infrastructure, electricity, getting food, transportation, everything that makes society work, free societies work, are susceptible to massive disruption today, either from intentional actors or from things like the pandemic. And we're not resilient enough to those challenges, and those are really security challenges. So I think we should lift the notion of resilience now and make it a core task and define together NATO's role in that task. NATO doesn't have to lead on all of those kinds of issues. Sometimes it would be the supporting organization. But you see in the pandemic, NATO has had to do a lot of crisis management and resilience efforts to help weak countries. It also opens a new way of NATO and the EU to work together, because resilience, frankly, is the leading area of NATO-EU cooperation. So that's a big agenda. It's an energetic, ambitious one. But I think Latvia has the experience with having to be a resilient country that will help us understand how to operationalize that notion. So in all those areas, you don't have to be a big country to contribute. I think sometimes the experience of smaller countries and things like resilience are more relevant, frankly, and more critical to the kind of debate we have. So I hope we will embrace a robust, activist, energetic, campaign to reinvent the alliance for the future.
Thank you, Professor, for the reflection. And also China, I have to ask on China maybe a bit more specifically. Of course, China is a big issue. It is ever-growing power in many ways. And there has been also more of China here in the Baltics. And the Belt and Road Initiative and the 16+1, now 17+1 format in 2016. Riga hosted the summit of 16+1 format, and Latvia was quite energetic in engaging with China, but things have changed since then a bit, I would say so. Not only China has become more restrictive in recent years, but there is also, if I may put it so, a kind of fatigue, because there were high hopes of the economic engagement, but we do not see that visible results so far. But it's clear that there will be more and more issues with China, and we understand that there's also a bipartisan understanding in the Congress that China is the main competitor, or put it, adversary. What would you suggest for the Baltic states on how to approach China in regards also with the transatlantic dialogue? So how to deal with China in a way that does not attract negative attention from the states?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, again, I think you're right. There's a bipartisan consensus now, but I think the tactics of how to address China are different. The Trump administration was guided by the slogan of great power competition, but what they meant really was just China. They kind of ignored Russia. Joe Biden has said very clearly, he says, Russia is our greatest threat, not China. China is our greatest rival. And there is a big difference. One needs to, not lump those two countries into one basket, but look at the challenge each presents on its own. And I think that would be one distinctive difference with a different administration. The second is that President Trump tried to take on China on his own and beat up his allies rather than trying to get them engaged in a common sort of approach. Joe Biden is the opposite. Instinctively, he will, again, partner of first resort is Europe. You turn to the Europeans to say, what should we do now? What do you think? Let's get this act together. Because we actually, I think, across the Atlantic agree on many issues that are troubling that are coming from China. My suggestion is just to take actually the EU's own frame and let's make that a transatlantic one. And the EU has said they think of China in three ways. First of all, in some areas, China could in fact be a partner. Let's focus together on what are those areas and where we might want to engage China. Global health issues clearly is one. Climate change certainly is one. We have worked with China on anti-piracy issues, for instance. So there are some areas where we could think of China as a partner. The second area the EU has talked about is China as a competitor. And here the EU has tended to mean economic competition. And here the EU and the US fundamentally agree on most of the problems China has created by not living up to its responsibilities in the WTO, of state, subsidies, state-owned enterprises not, sort of holding to the rules, restricting investment in China, forcing Western companies to hand over technology. I mean, a whole host of things where we agree. So let's just, and together we are half the global economy together. So not China. So we have considerable resources to engage China as a competitor. And then thirdly, the issue of China as a systemic rival. China today is questioning basic principles of the rules-based order. It's either trying to erode those principles or is trying to establish alternative principles. And that over time is problematic. And we should engage on what those core principles are. That's why when I say we have to reaffirm our shared values, that's the basis for also engaging with China. So I think that would be a positive agenda for the transatlantic relationship. It gets us on the right track. It's realistic with China. It doesn't paint China into a corner. It says to Chinese leaders, there are areas we want to work with you on. We have some problems in some areas, and we have to think about world order and how we structure that as we go forward. I think that's a realistic agenda. It should be done with our European partners and not against them, which has been the last 4 years.
Professor Hamilton, thank you so much for your views on how are things in the US and with regards to Baltics and the Transatlantic Alliance at large. Thank you very much for joining us from Washington, D.C. and we will follow, of course, how things will unfold in the United States and we'll try to use also the suggestions that you provided. Thank you very much. And
thanks
goodbye.
so much. It was great to be with you. I appreciate it. Thank you.